Okay, great. Well, like I said, I'm really touched to be invited to present to you all today, and really honored to follow both Dr. Vega and Emily, who provided a lot of powerful information that I think really lends itself to the conversation to follow. So like was mentioned, I do quite a bit of research on understanding and increasingly learning how we can help people living with epilepsy cope with stigma. And so that'll be the focus of today's talk. I do have some disclosures. So I do receive grant funding from the Epilepsy Foundation, Rhode Island Hospital, and a couple of R01s. And I do fulfill an advocacy role for the International Neuropsychology Society's Epilepsy Special Interest Group. But if there are opportunities to collaborate, please keep me in mind, because I will happily do science for food, and I like connecting with like-minded people. So, you know, in addition to the two talks that preceded mine, these questions that have been coming up during the breaks have also been really interesting, because they highlight a lot of the historical and cultural underpinnings of stigma and epilepsy. And I really like this quote to sort of set the stage from it's either a sociologist or a cultural anthropologist, who put forth that the history of epilepsy is such that it can be summarized as 4,000 years of ignorance, superstition, and stigma, followed by 100 years of knowledge, superstition, and stigma. Which is to say that even though we know a lot more and have come very far, there are many things that are still sort of stuck in their tracks when it comes to the psychosocial difficulties and biases that go along for people living with epilepsy. And that's because, you know, despite all the knowledge and advancement that we've made, there are still a lot of people, as you've heard, living with epilepsy actively. The treatment regimens are complex and come along with side effects as well as benefits. Depending on the study sample that you look at, a large swath of people are still having uncontrolled seizures despite treatments. And, you know, just like is sort of at the crux of this conference today, a lot of comorbidities that go along with living with seizures. So even though seizures last seconds to minutes in most people, you know, those other psychosocial and physical comorbidities linger and create a lot of challenges for patients to self-manage, not to mention what has been said already, that, you know, there are all these other scary things that can happen, like injury and death. And so, you know, the social implications of all those things, unfortunately, when you look at large samples of people, are such that, you know, there's a lot of unemployment, there's a lot of disability, there's reduced educational attainment, reduced incomes, not just affecting the individual living with epilepsy, but their entire household, and increased social isolation, which really does pack a punch. And so when we think about, you know, sort of functional outcomes in epilepsy, there are a lot of things that people living with seizure disorders, active or otherwise, are less likely to do, including graduate from high school, drive, work in settings where employers accept liability for injury. And unemployment rates are quite high, you know, especially when we're talking about comprehensive epilepsy centers like ours, and those represented by members on this call today. They can be as high as about 50% of people. And even in the people that are working, only about a quarter do so full time. And so, you know, among those, there's even less who are actually working for pay. And so, you know, then you think about the ones that are working for pay, and those individuals have been reported as missing 3 times the number of work days than their healthy peers. And that accounts for, you know, nearly $10,000 in lost wages for when this study was done. And so, you know, that kind of tells you why household incomes are low and why people, you know, with seizure disorders may just be struggling functionally in general. But then what about attitudes for the individual and those around them? So nearly half of people with epilepsy endorse a fear of discrimination in the workplace, being treated unfairly. And this is reinforced by, albeit, you know, quite some years ago, the only paper that I found that has sought to document examples of negative workplace attitudes held by employers who do have people with epilepsy employed within their services or maybe don't want to employ people with epilepsy. And so, this probably doesn't surprise many people on this conference to hear that folks living with seizures are discouraged often from aspiring to greater vocational heights. Not all, but many. And there is consequently a tendency to work in sort of unskilled jobs. And so, when we think not just about sort of the workspace or the educational space, and we think about more psychological and social difficulty at the interpersonal and intrapersonal level, there are a lot of common mental health concerns, some of which you've heard about today. So on the milder end of the spectrum, you can have things like poor self-esteem, reduced self-efficacy, or feeling like one can't do things that their healthy peers can more easily, increased social isolation, introverted behavior, which is to say sort of a preference towards solitude, and maybe some discomfort in being around others, increased neuroticism, or a sensitivity to distress or being more stress reactive. And then, of course, increased rates of depression, anxiety, and other more acute mental health comorbidities. But I'm here to sort of talk about how stigma beliefs are really, setting the stage or helping to perpetuate many of these things that come before it on the list. And so when we talk about, how epilepsy is a stigmatized condition, I think it's important to disentangle it from discrimination. So, discrimination against people with epilepsy does stem from its cultural origins of, being considered sort of a condition that, hundreds of years ago was akin to demonic possession, right? And so, there's a lot of misunderstanding that goes along with epilepsy, and the public's perception of it has changed increasingly over the years with more representation in media and so forth, as well as the fact that discriminatory laws have been abolished in modern times, at least many of them. But as you heard in one of the preceding questions, people with epilepsy weren't allowed to marry in 17 states until 1956. And Missouri was the last US state to reverse this law, but only did so in 1980. And in some parts of the world, I mentioned my work in the International Neuropsychological Society's Epilepsy Special Interest Group. I have colleagues who work in India, where stigma really abounds, and where arranged marriage is more the norm than love marriage. There really is a lot of fear around disclosure of epilepsy, even if someone has had successful epilepsy surgery, for example, because it may mean the difference between becoming married or not in cultures like that to this day. And when we think about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I think is a real win for people living with chronic health conditions, that itself has only been signed into law as recently as 1990, and implementation of that, I think, has been variable since. And so, despite all these societal advances that have, made real strides in stomping out discrimination, there is this less talked about, I think, or increasingly talked about, I should say, internalized or perceived stigma that remains really, really common for folks with epilepsy. And, when we talk about the difference between stigma and discrimination, I really like putting up this image here. And so if you look on the right side of the image, you see this person who's, put together and well-dressed, maybe on their way to, work or a social gathering or school or something like that, and you wouldn't bat an eyelash at this person if you saw them walking down the street. But when that individual is looking into the mirror at themselves, what they see is a patient. That person's wearing a Johnny, they're disheveled, they're wearing, slip-proof hospital socks, right? And so I think of this image when I imagine what internalized stigma looks and feels like, because to everyone else, they wouldn't know. But to that individual, they're walking around with that other image, foremost on their mind. And so if we think about the definition of stigma as it was first put forth in the early 2000s, it really just in general refers to this loss of status and power resulting from the separation of those who are stigmatized from the general population because of some characteristic that has been culturally defined as different and undesirable. And so when we add the perceived nature to that, this perceived stigma is really referring to that internalization of things like embarrassment and shame around having an illness and the fear that one may encounter discrimination. And so when you look at big studies, about 1 out of every 2 people with epilepsy endorse being impacted by stigma in this way. And so what is that impact? So I think it is important to note that stigma does not just stem from discrimination that was enacted against an individual, like someone who was fired because they had epilepsy. It affects newly diagnosed people, people who are drug resistant, and people who are seizure free. And so, that lingering internalization of stigma and fear of discrimination or discomfort around others, around the fact that one has epilepsy, is something that really follows people. And it doesn't discriminate. About half of individuals with epilepsy believe that the general public has a negative view of them, and 41% of those individuals say that this belief negatively impacts their own self-concept. It can lead to maladaptive coping, some of which we've heard about today. I can't help but think about Dr. Vega's case example of the person whose seizures came back and didn't want to go through the ordeal that they originally went through again. And so, they withdrew socially, they engaged in secrecy and concealment, and those unfortunately are some of the most common coping mechanisms, if you will, that avoidance that stem from stigma. And so, for example, 1 out of 5 people with epilepsy have at some point actively denied having a seizure disorder. Stigma has been known to cause delays in or rejection of a formal diagnosis and care. And, no surprise here, it negatively impacts quality of life across a variety of spectra. And in that same vein, especially as it gets more pronounced and more difficult to cope with, psychiatric symptoms, a host of them really are linked back to stigma, and we'll talk about that more specifically. So here we have a study that we did, and I should say all my work has been in adults, but I think it's a really good opportunity to talk with people who are themselves children or youth, or work with children or youth affected by epilepsy, because this is sort of a potential future. And I think that, like with all health conditions, if we can intervene early, we can hopefully have more of an impact. And so, in this study, which was predominantly conducted with racial and ethnic minorities with epilepsy, about 43% of this sample had an anxiety disorder. About more than a quarter of whom had, moderate or severe anxiety. The 2 most common types of anxiety disorders were agoraphobia and social phobia, or social anxiety. And those with an anxiety disorder tended to have convulsive seizures, reported greater seizure worry, and endorsed higher levels of perceived stigma. But when you modeled all of those risk factors for having an anxiety disorder together at once, the only independent significant predictor of who had an anxiety disorder was perceived stigma. Now, in this study, which was recently published, we found that nearly half of the sample also qualified for a major depressive episode, and that more severe depressive symptoms were linked to perceptions of illness, specifically that epilepsy was having negative consequences on the individual's life, and that their treatments were insufficient to deal with those consequences, and that all of this was hard for them to even comprehend themselves. And interestingly, I really tried to find a copy of this study that just came out in Epilepsy and Behavior from Lee, Lim, and Choi, but I couldn't retrieve it online yet. I think it's really hot off the presses. But in that study, there was this demonstration of a significant interaction between perceived stress and perceived stigma in the expression of depressive symptoms. Interestingly, the way it broke out was that the association between heightened stress and worse depression was only significant for people who were endorsing perceived stigma. So people who had epilepsy that were not feeling stigmatized, there was no relationship between their stress level and their depression symptoms. It was only for those who actually endorsed feeling stigmatized. And that says a lot, because if we then go kind of forward and carry through that theme that Dr. Vega was speaking about earlier, perceived stigma can be sort of an antecedent variable. I hope you can see my cursor sort of circling on perceived stigma in the lowermost left-hand box, where in this mediation study, it's really a moderated mediation study, it links a lot of the things that we've been talking about, where people with higher levels of stigma who are unemployed are then more likely to endorse worse depression severity and are therefore more likely to report suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And so, there's something about stigma and its influence that under certain conditions might be expressed more strongly and then lead to more severe mental health comorbidities. And then, of course, some of those scarier outcomes that we really want to stay ahead of. And this is true even in the space related to treatment adherence. We know that people whose epilepsy is more difficult to control are, going to have a harder time with feeling like they are really having living their best life. And so here we see that stigma led to less information seeking from healthcare professionals, less behavioral skills important for managing treatments, and overall less adherence. And so again, it's stigma sort of leading the charge for whether or not people can be as self-confident and efficacious as someone like Emily, who we just heard from, who are really there being able to say to their healthcare professionals who maybe aren't interacting with them in the way that they feel most comfortable, like, well, actually, no, this is what I think I can do, and this is what I am doing, this is how I need your help. And so it can really lead to an unfortunate interaction even in that space. And that's important to note, because we've done work that has shown that in a month's time, people whose anti-seizure medication taking behavior was electronically monitored, only about 72% were taking their medications as indicated, and that people were missing an average of 11 doses per month. And that additional work that we've done has shown that their beliefs about their medications, such that they feel like their medications are more harmful, less beneficial, and more concerning to them, are also linked to how adherent they are to those medications. And then a recent poster that we presented showed that even when you partial out knowledge about epilepsy and its treatments, how much someone knows what to do doesn't really affect what they actually do. And it's really these negative beliefs that dictate to a large extent the behavior that they engage in. And I really think of stigma as being a set of beliefs that people kind of make their own. Unfortunately, the predictors of who will feel stigma and how strongly are really not fully understood. It's really great that we're doing this conference, like I said, for children and youth with epilepsy, because earlier age of onset of seizures is linked to worse stigma over time. Like we've shown, low educational attainment, unemployment as well, seizure frequency, which is why treatment adherence and effectiveness of treatments is so important, among many other reasons, obviously. To the extent possible, maximizing benefit while reducing side effects of anti-seizure medications is also important, because side effects are linked to worse stigma. And, at the intrapersonal level, like we've talked about, being more worried about having seizures and what that will mean for the person, poor self-efficacy, and limited social support also pack a punch. This is work that I really have continued to look back on as a defining feature of how we can try and intervene early. Stigma beliefs seem to be integrated with aspects of personality, specifically those that make someone more prone to experiencing stress or more prone to prefer solitude. And so, what this showed is that these personality traits, specifically those of neuroticism or stress reactivity, and introversion, or that, preference towards solitude, these are, in the general population, normative variations in how we think, feel, react, and relate to others. We all have certain extent of this. It's sort of like, we all have levels. It's not necessarily pathological. And even though it's based in personality, these are like, tendencies that we all have, they can be influenced and exacerbated by meaningful life experiences. And so when we think about epilepsy, living with the unpredictability of having seizures, experiencing barriers to social advancement and independence, like we've talked about so far, either the experience of or fear of enacted discrimination as well, can all lead to internalized stigma, and kind of blend with these personality tendencies of being more reactive to stress and more likely to retreat into solitude than being among others. I didn't pay Dr. Vega to talk about this, but I do think it's very interesting how he referenced this tendency toward getting stuck in negative patterns of thinking, or having deficits or weaknesses in problem solving, because we found the same thing. So to unpack this figure for you, on the leftmost axis, you see perceived epilepsy stigma, less stigma, more stigma. And then you see modeled on the bottom, or the x-axis, executive functioning. So from the left to the right, like low average, average, and above average executive functioning, which is sort of a composite of how flexibly someone can come up with ideas, shift their way of thinking, and solve problems. And so what this graph shows is that people who are experiencing less stress reactivity, or less neuroticism, or an average level of neuroticism, and have better executive functioning or better problem solving abilities, they are much more likely to experience less perceived epilepsy stigma. But that when someone is in this high neuroticism or red sort of group, where they're very stress reactive, doesn't really matter how good their problem solving is, because they get sort of stuck in that mode. And they don't have the beneficial effect from the problem solving at that point to be able to further reduce their experience of stigma. That's how I read that graph. So the interplay of stress, problem solving, and stigma is an important one if we're going to try and sort of intervene to make people feel less isolated, insecure, ashamed, avoidant, embarrassed, and worried and lonely. And so people who are getting stuck in these negative patterns of thinking, I mean, you've met them, you've encountered them. So for people who have a seizure in the community and feel like they can't go back out because they're going to be looked at differently by others, and they don't really know how to explain that to people. Someone who had a stroke, for example, and then later on went on to develop a seizure disorder, and now they can't enjoy their retirement. They can't go out with their golf buddies in the same way because they feel so different. Someone who is not telling their partner that they feel like they're treating them differently because now they have seizures, or someone who is newly diagnosed and now in a school college setting, for example, and doesn't quite know how to make friends or go out with their friends if they're staying out late, or maybe drinking, and they worry that might trigger a seizure. Or maybe they've started at a new job and they're having bad medication side effects and they feel like that's compromising their performance. I mean, these are the kinds of things that cause people to get stuck in these modes and experience again and again the effects of stigma. And so, epilepsy serving organizations worldwide recognize this, and they really have put out a call to arms to do whatever we can as a field to stomp out stigma to the extent possible. And self-management programs, which are a big part of the sort of patchwork of how professionals and patients come together to help individuals living with epilepsy take better control over their lives, is a great sort of boon for the field. But historically, it hasn't really addressed the issue of stigma all that effectively. There are a lot of programs, this is part of a telehealth conference that do offer, telehealth and virtual sort of media for helping people to address various comorbidities in epilepsy, but it's really a hole, in my opinion, a missing piece in the puzzle to create something that does the same for epilepsy stigma, especially given how efficacious these epilepsy self-management programs have been to a variety of other outcomes. And so myself and other members of a team that's newly established are really seeking to fill this space and create a telehealth accessible model of treatment for reducing epilepsy stigma. We have tried to learn from past efforts, that unfortunately haven't been all that effective. So there have been nurse-led interventions at ER visits after a seizure, parent and child dyad education sessions, peer support groups, all of which have really important elements to them, but really haven't yet taught evidence-based coping skills in a systematic way, or provided a format that is easily accessible and scalable for the most people. And so that's what our program, which we call Rise Above, aims to do. We presented the original concept of Rise Above to people with epilepsy, and we heard from them, and they told us that navigating stigma is stressful and can be overwhelming. Many expressed feeling misunderstood by and at the mercy of others' misconceptions of epilepsy. They often, talked about their perception of social rejection and how that influenced their own decisions about social behavior and relationships. And they indicated that concealment and isolation were common approaches that they used to cope with anticipated rejection. And despite all that, they also acknowledged that the perception of what others think may not actually reflect what they actually think about them, and they welcomed an intervention that would help them manage stress, navigate social situations more effectively, and set manageable goals to experience success in overcoming stigma-related challenges. And so we've created this modular intervention that does just that, to help people manage stress, recognize the signs of stigma from actual patients' sort of experiences, reframe the beliefs and thoughts that go into that, and problem solve situations specifically related to stigma in order to reduce it. And so if I can sort of show very briefly a little bit about sort of where we're at with this. So I'm just going to share my screen again. And so this is Rise Above. It's laid out so that hopefully people can access it easily. We provide education on, stigma and how it affects people. We, throughout the program, offer helpful videos to orient people to the various modules, which I've outlined, and that people can come back to again and again. Every single module, again, has helpful videos to help users get started, and exercises, in this case, diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness meditations, and visualization exercises, and the opportunity to track progress before and after engaging in these sorts of exercises. The Recognizing Stigma section really does take people through these kinds of real life examples that we were talking about, and then helping them recognize what in these examples are related to stigma and are not. And then, as they go through that, learning to take another look at these stigma thoughts and beliefs by learning how their thoughts might be unbalanced, checking what aspect of their thought is a fact or an opinion, and then weighing the evidence for those things that are still lingering, those opinions that still really distress them. And then they're currently programming problem solving. So I will just sort of highlight for you guys again the idea here that, sorry, I got to share that one more time. That problem solving is really, see, are we back? Yes, problem solving is about looking at the stigma problem, setting a realistic goal around addressing it, coming up with solutions that may not be perfect, but may help, you maximize pros and reduce cons to address the problem in a very action-oriented way, and then know sort of that you're making good progress toward, helping to reduce the problem at hand, rather than just getting stuck in the stigmatized feelings. And so, I mentioned the Epilepsy Foundation grant funding that we received and are so grateful for. We're in the process of beta testing this whole program in a group of people with epilepsy. We'll be conducting focus groups where we invite our target users to share their experiences and make specific recommendations, so that this is a program that people feel like they're really going to get use out of and benefit from, so that we can optimize it to meet the needs of the people that we hope to serve to reduce stigma. And that will hopefully, we imagine, result in a highly accessible, equitable, and empowering resource for the world of people with epilepsy that we aim to share at really low to, I hope, no cost to help the most people possible. In the meantime, there are a lot of anti-discrimination campaigns and resources out there that people can access, to help, like conferences like these, make clear sort of what epilepsy is and is not, and how to best cope with it. I've mentioned the Managing Epilepsy Well Network, which is a CDC-sponsored network of programs, many of which are web-based or telephone accessible, that can help people manage, many of the mental health comorbidities and other sorts of intricacies of living with a seizure disorder. And then lots and lots of local resources, both through the Epilepsy Foundation, and then, because I imagine a lot of folks are tuning in from Massachusetts, different sorts of advocacy groups and practical, concrete community-led initiatives like Advocating for Children and, parent information networks, as people get older and are in the workforce or trying to be, career centers and vocational rehabilitation programs, as well as disability law centers that are really out there to help people make the most of their lives, with seizure disorders, not be sort of, stopped in their tracks as a result. And so with that, I'm done with my presentation and looking forward to the panel.